Welcome to Marple Mysteries, where every clue matters, and every secret has a story. Join us on a journey through Agatha Christie's most intriguing mysteries, narrated with immersive storytelling. Stay sharp, listen closely, and let's solve the case together. The mystery begins now. Chapter 1. The interrupted celebration, the morning of June 15th, dawned bright and clear over the village of St. Mary Mead, bathing the ancient stone church and surrounding cottages in golden summer light. The air was perfumed with roses and honeysuckle, a perfect day for a wedding. Along the high street, windows had been polished to gleaming, and small Union Jack bunting hung from several shop fronts in honor of the occasion. The marriage of Diana Lacey to Richard Carmichael was the most anticipated event of the year. Diana, the only daughter of Sir William Lacey of Gossington Hall, had grown up in the village before being sent away to finishing school in Switzerland. Her return 3 months ago, engaged to the handsome and wealthy Richard Carmichael of the London Carmichaels, had set tongues wagging across the county. In her cottage at the edge of the village, Miss Jane Marple stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the pale blue hat she had chosen for the occasion. Though not particularly close to the Lacey family, she had known Diana since she was a child. A spirited girl, perhaps a touch willful, but with a kind heart. Miss Marple had received an invitation along with most of the other village residents. Sir William had always been democratic in his social engagements, a trait that had earned him both admiration and a certain amount of perplexed disapproval from his peers. "There now," Miss Marple murmured to herself, giving the hat a final pat. She picked up her handbag and gloves and made her way downstairs, where her maid, Cherry, was waiting to see her off. "You look lovely, Miss Marple," Cherry said, handing her a light shawl despite the warmth of the day, just in case it turns cool later. "Thank you, Cherry," Miss Marple replied with a smile. "I don't expect I'll be late. It's the wedding breakfast. Afterward at Gossington Hall, and I dare say I'll have had quite enough excitement by tea time." As Miss Marple made her way toward the church, she passed several other locals similarly attired in their finest. The postmistress, Mrs. Blade, hurried by with her husband, giving a quick nod of greeting. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Isn't it a beautiful day for it?" called out Mrs. Blackett, the doctor's wife, who was walking with her husband. "Indeed it is," Miss Marple agreed, "a most fortuitous omen for the young couple." By the time Miss Marple reached the church, most of the guests had arrived. The small churchyard was crowded with shiny motor cars from London, their chauffeurs standing at ease beside them, exchanging pleasantries and cigarettes. Miss Marple slipped quietly into the church, nodding to acquaintances as she made her way to a pew near the middle, where she had a good view of both the altar and the congregation. Inspector Craddock, who had retired to St. Mary Mead the previous year, tipped his hat to her from across the aisle. Since his retirement, he had become something of a reluctant confidant to Miss Marple, who had an uncanny knack for finding herself involved in matters that were, strictly speaking, police business. He sometimes wondered if crime followed the gentle-looking old lady, or if her sharp eyes simply noticed what others overlooked. The church filled quickly. The local gentry and village folk occupied the bride's side, while the groom's guests, mostly elegant Londoners, whom no one in St. Mary Mead recognized, filled the other side. Miss Marple observed them all with interest, noting the subtle social dynamics at play. The way Sir William's sister-in-law, Mildred Lacey, kept glancing disapprovingly at Diana's school friend Pamela, whose dress was perhaps a touch too fashionable for a country wedding. The manner in which Richard Carmichael's best man, a jovial-looking man with a red face, seemed slightly uncomfortable in his formal attire, tugging at his collar when he thought no one was looking. The organ began to play, and everyone rose, turning expectantly toward the entrance. Richard Carmichael took his place at the altar, his expression a mixture of nervousness and happiness. He was a tall, distinguished-looking man in his mid-30s, with dark hair just beginning to gray at the temples. At precisely 11 o'clock, the church doors opened. Sir William appeared, resplendent in morning dress, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight that streamed through the doorway. He stood alone, looking confused. A murmur rippled through the congregation. The organ music faltered, then continued. Miss Marple watched as the vicar's wife hurried to the door, spoke briefly with Sir William, then scurried back to whisper to Tideti, her husband. The vicar's face registered surprise, followed by concern. He nodded and stepped forward, gesturing for the organist to stop playing. "Ladies and gentlemen," the vicar announced, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "It appears there will be a slight delay. If you would be so kind as to remain seated, I'm sure everything will be sorted out momentarily." The murmuring grew louder. Sir William disappeared outside, followed quickly by Richard Carmichael and his best man. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The atmosphere in the church shifted from anticipation to confusion, then to concern. Finally, Sir William reappeared at the front of the church. His face was ashen as he addressed the assembled guests. "I'm afraid I must make a most distressing announcement," he said, his voice strained. "It seems that my daughter Diana is not present. She appears to have left the house early this morning, leaving only a brief note saying she needed time to think. No one has seen her since." A collective gasp filled the church. "Richard." Carmichael stood behind Sir William, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "The wedding," Sir William continued after clearing his throat, "must, of course, be postponed. I offer my sincere apologies to you all, especially to those who have traveled far to be here today." As the congregation broke into shocked exclamations and hurried whispers, Miss Marple remained silent, her keen blue eyes taking in every detail. There was the bridegroom, now in animated conversation with his best man, his expression shifting from bewilderment to anger. There was Mrs. Henderson, Diana's former nanny, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. And there, interestingly, was Pamela, Diana's school friend, whose face showed not shock, but something closer to— was it relief? Miss Marple's lips tightened slightly. The disappearance of a bride on her wedding day was dramatic, certainly, but not unprecedented. Young women sometimes experienced last-minute doubts, but as the guests began to file out of the church, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to scandalized to secretly delighted at such a juicy piece of gossip, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel a prickle of unease. Diana Lacey had not struck her as the type of girl to flee from commitment without good reason, and that note, needing time to think, seemed oddly trite for such a momentous decision. As Miss Marple made her way slowly back to her cottage, her mind was already turning over the curious case of the vanishing bride. Chapter 2. Whispers and Theories. By afternoon, the news of Diana Lacey's disappearance had spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire. The village, which had anticipated celebrating a joyous occasion, now buzzed with speculation and concern. Groups gathered at the vicarage, outside the post office, and in the snug of the Blue Boar pub, all discussing the same thing. What had happened to the bride? Miss Marple had just settled in her garden with a cup of tea when her neighbor, Colonel Defiance Bantry, appeared at the gate, his expression grave. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he called. "I suppose you've heard all about this business at Gossington Hall?" "Indeed, Colonel," she replied, gesturing for him to join her. "Most distressing for everyone concerned." The colonel took a seat, accepting the cup of tea Cherry brought out for him. "Never cared much for that Carmichael fellow myself," he said, bluntly. "Something not quite right about him. Too smooth by half." "You think he might have something to do with Diana's disappearance?" Miss Marple asked mildly, her fingers busy with her knitting needles. "Well, I wouldn't go that far," Colonel Bantry backtracked. "But I heard from James at the post office that Sir William has called in Scotland Yard. Not just treating it as cold feet anymore." "Scotland Yard?" Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "That does suggest something more serious." "The maid at Gossington Hall, Jenny, is it, told Mrs. Bantry that Diana's bedroom was in a terrible state. Things thrown about, her jewelry box emptied. Looks more like she was taken than left of her own accord." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. "How very concerning," she murmured. "And this information hasn't been made public?" "Not yet," the colonel confirmed, "but it will be soon enough. Nothing stays secret in St. Mary Mead for long." As if to prove his point, Dr. Haydock's car pulled up outside Miss Marple's cottage. The village doctor climbed out, medical bag in hand, and made his way to the garden gate. "Miss Marple, Colonel," he greeted them. "I've just come from Gossington Hall. Sir William insisted I give him something to help him sleep. The poor man is beside himself." "Any news of Diana?" Colonel Bantry asked eagerly. Dr. Haydock shook his head. "Nothing concrete. But I can tell you that Inspector Craddock has been called out of retirement to assist until the Scotland Yard detective arrives tomorrow. They're treating it as suspicious now." "What changed their minds?" Miss Marple inquired, her voice gentle but her eyes sharp. "Several things," Dr. Haydock said, accepting the tea Cherry had appeared with. "Thank you, my dear. For one thing, Diana's passport is still in her room. If she'd planned to run away, one would expect her to take it. Then there's the blood." "Blood?" both Miss Marple and Colonel Bantry exclaimed simultaneously. "Just a small amount," the doctor quickly clarified. "On the edge of the window-sill in her room. Could be nothing. A small cut, while she was getting ready, perhaps. But given the circumstances—" The three fell silent, contemplating the implications. It was Colonel Bantry who eventually spoke. "What about the fiancé, Carmichael? Where's he in all this?" "Still at Gossington Hall," Dr. Haydock replied, "insisting on being involved in the search. He and Sir William have been arguing, I'm told. Sir William blames him somehow, though I can't see why." "Perhaps Sir William knows something we don't," Miss Marple suggested quietly. After the doctor and colonel had departed, Miss Marple sat for a while longer in her garden, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The evening light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across her immaculate flower beds. Something about the case troubled her deeply, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of another visitor, Pamela Brewster, Diana's school friend, whom Miss Marple had noticed in the church earlier. The young woman looked nervous, twisting her handbag strap between her fingers. "Miss Marple," she began hesitantly, "I hope you don't mind my stopping by. Mrs. Blackett mentioned you might be willing to talk to me." "Of course, my dear," Missy Marple said, gesturing to the seat recently vacated by Colonel Bantry. "You're Diana's friend from Switzerland, aren't you?" Pamela nodded, perching on the edge of the chair. "That's right. We were at school together. I feel terrible about what's happened. Everyone's looking at me strangely because I'm staying at Gossington Hall. I heard some of the village women whispering that I might know something." "And do you?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but direct. Pamela's eyes widened. "No. Well, not about her disappearance, but—" She hesitated, glancing around as if to ensure they were alone. "Diana wasn't happy, Miss Marple. She didn't want to marry Richard. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. Yet the wedding was planned, invitations sent, preparations made. Why proceed so far if she had doubts? It's complicated, Pamela sighed. Diana's father has financial difficulties. The marriage to Richard would solve them. Diana felt obligated. I see, Miss Marple nodded. And did she confide these doubts to anyone besides you? She tried to talk to her father, but he dismissed her concerns. Said it was just nerves. Pamela twisted her handkerchief. And then there was the argument? Argument! The night before the wedding. I overheard Diana and Richard arguing in the library. I couldn't hear everything, but Diana said something about not being part of it anymore, and Richard replied that it was too late to back out now. He sounded threatening. Miss Marple considered this new information carefully. Did you mention this to Inspector Craddock? No, Pamela admitted, looking ashamed. I was afraid. Richard has been watching me all day, and Sir William is already so upset. But when I heard they found blood... Her voice broke slightly. My dear, Miss Marple said firmly, you must tell the inspector what you've told me. It could be important. I know, Pamela nodded. I'm going to. I just needed to tell someone first. Someone who might understand. After Pamela left, promising to speak with Inspector Craddock that evening, Miss Marple sat in thoughtful silence. The case was growing more complex by the hour. A reluctant bride, financial difficulties, a mysterious argument, and now blood. And there was something else, something about the timing of it all that nagged at her. She rose slowly and went inside, where Cherry was preparing a light supper. Cherry, Miss Marple asked, did you happen to notice if anyone was about unusually early this morning? Before the wedding? Cherry considered. As a matter of fact, I did see Mr. Carmichael's car driving past around 6, heading out of the village. Thought it odd at the time, him being the groom and all, shouldn't have been out and about that early. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured. Most interesting. As darkness fell over St. Mary Mead, the village settled into an uneasy quiet. At Gossington Hall, lights burned late into the night as the search for Diana continued. And in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window, her mind methodically sorting through the pieces of the puzzle, comparing them to other patterns she had observed over her long life. Something told her that this was more than a case of a frightened bride. Much more. Chapter 3. Early Inquiries. The following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to the arrival of Detective Inspector Barnaby from Scotland Yard. His dark sedan pulled up in front of Gossington Hall just as Miss Marple was making her way to the vicarage for a meeting of the Women's Institute, which had been hastily converted into a volunteer search coordination center. Miss Marple paused by the low stone wall bordering Gossington's grounds, watching as the tall, austere man in a charcoal suit emerged from the car. Inspector Craddock came out to greet him, the two men shaking hands before disappearing inside the house. Miss Marple noted with interest that Sir William was not there to welcome the Scotland Yard detective. According to Mrs. Blade, who had stopped by Miss Marple's cottage earlier with a delivery of fresh eggs, Sir William had taken to his bed, overcome with distress. At the vicarage, Miss Marple found a hive of activity. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, was organizing groups of villagers to search different areas around St. Mary Mead. "Ah, Miss Marple," Mrs. Clement called out, looking relieved to see her. "I was hoping you would come. We need someone sensible to coordinate with the police. They're interviewing everyone who was at Gossington Hall yesterday morning." "I'd be happy to help," Miss Marple replied, setting down her basket. "Has there been any news?" Before Mrs. Clement could answer, Pamela Brewster rushed in, her face pale. "They've found Diana's silver hairbrush and a scarf by the old mill pond," she announced breathlessly. "They're dragging it now." A hush fell over the room, followed by a flurry of whispered comments. Miss Marple observed the young woman carefully. There was genuine distress in her expression, but also something else, a tightness around her mouth that suggested she was holding something back. "Did you speak with Inspector Craddock yesterday evening, as you intended?" Miss Marple asked quietly, moving to stand beside Pamela. The young woman nodded. "Yes, I told him about the argument I overheard. He seemed very interested, especially when I mentioned that Diana said she wouldn't be part of it anymore." "Part of what, I wonder?" Miss Marple mused. "That's just it," Pamela replied, lowering her voice. "I don't know. Diana had been acting strangely for weeks, not just nervous about the wedding, but secretive. She kept receiving telephone calls that made her agitated. Once, I came into her room and found her quickly hiding something in her jewelry box." This was new information. Miss Marple was about to probe further when the vicarage door opened and Richard Carmichael strode in, accompanied by his best man, whom Miss Marple now knew to be Edward Latimer, a business associate from London. "Ladies," Richard addressed the room, his voice strained but controlled, "I want to thank you all for your efforts. I've hired additional private investigators to supplement the police search, and Mr. Latimer has organized a substantial reward for information." Richard's gaze swept the room, pausing briefly when he spotted Pamela standing with Miss Marple. Something flickered across his face, annoyance, perhaps, or suspicion, before he smoothed his expression back to one of grateful concern. "Mr. Carmichael," Miss Marple said, stepping forward slightly, "what a difficult time this must be for you. I understand you were seen leaving the village early yesterday morning?" A momentary silence fell over the room. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Yes, that's correct. I couldn't sleep, so I drove to the next village to fetch fresh flowers for Diana. A surprise. I left them with her lady's maid to be placed in her room when she woke." He paused, then added pointedly, "Inspector Craddock has already confirmed this with both the florist and the maid." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple murmured. Diana was fortunate to have such an attentive fiancé. Before Richard could respond, the door opened again, and Inspector Craddock appeared, looking grave. "Mr. Carmichael," he said, "Inspector Barnaby would like to speak with you again at Gossington Hall." "Of course," Richard replied. He turned to address the room once more. "Please continue your efforts. I remain hopeful that Diana will be found safe." After Richard and his friend had departed with Inspector Craddock, the atmosphere in the vicarage relaxed noticeably. The women returned to their organization of search parties, though with a more subdued air now that the possibility of tragedy loomed larger. Miss Marple slipped out quietly, making her way toward the path that led to the old mill pond. Rather than joining the crowd gathered at the water's edge, however, she took a different route, one that led to Diana's childhood haunt, a small gazebo overlooking the estate's rose garden. As she had hoped, the area was deserted, everyone's attention focused on the pond. Miss Marple carefully examined the gazebo, noting the cushions on the bench were slightly damp from morning dew, suggesting they hadn't been disturbed recently. She was about to leave when a flash of white caught her eye from behind one of the rose bushes. Bending down with some difficulty, she retrieved a crumpled piece of paper, a receipt from a chemist in the neighboring town of Much Benham, dated the day before the wedding. The items purchased were smudged and difficult to read, but Miss Marple could make out sleeping tablets and something that looked like test kit. Tucking the receipt into her pocket, Miss Marple made her way back, toward the village. As she passed Gossington Hall, she noticed Mildred Lacey, Sir William's sister-in-law, emerging from a side entrance, The woman looked furtively around before hurrying toward her car, a large handbag clutched tightly to her chest. Miss Marple paused, pretending to adjust her shoe while observing Mildred's hasty departure. The woman had been living at Gossington Hall since the death of her sister, Diana's mother, some 15 years ago. According to village gossip, she had long harbored hopes of marrying Sir William herself, though he had shown no inclination in that direction. "Miss Marple," a voice called, interrupting her thoughts. "Just the person I was hoping to find." Inspector Craddock approached, looking tired but determined. "I thought you might be interested to know that we've found no trace of Diana in the pond, despite her belongings being discovered nearby. It appears they may have been placed there deliberately to mislead us." "Indeed?" Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly. "That would suggest premeditation, wouldn't it?" "Precisely," Craddock nodded. "And there's something else. The blood found in Diana's room? It wasn't hers. The type doesn't match her medical records." Miss Marple's eyes widened fractionally. "How very curious. Have you identified whose blood it might be?" "Not yet," Craddock admitted. "But we're testing it against samples from everyone in the household. Inspector Barnaby is quite thorough." "I'm sure he is," Miss Marple murmured. "Tell me, Inspector, did Diana have a lady's maid of her own, or did she share her aunt's maid?" Craddock looked surprised at the question. "She had her own, I believe. A young woman named Alice. Why do you ask?" "Merely curious," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Mr. Carmichael mentioned giving flowers to Diana's lady's maid early yesterday morning. I was wondering who that might have been." Craddock's expression sharpened. "That's interesting, because according to Alice, she never received any flowers from Mr. Carmichael yesterday." "How very odd," Miss Marple remarked, her face the picture of innocent confusion. "Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding." As Inspector Craddock hurried back to Gossington Hall with this new information, Miss Marple continued her walk into the village, her mind working steadily. The missing bride, the staged evidence at the pond, the blood of unknown origin, and now Richard Carmichael's apparent lie about the flowers. The case was growing more complex by the hour. And somewhere in the tangle of deception and misdirection lay the truth about what had happened to Diana Lacey. Chapter 4. The first suspect by mid-afternoon, news had spread throughout St. Mary Mead that Richard Carmichael was being formally questioned at the police station in Much Benham. Miss Marple heard this from Mrs. Blackett, who stopped by with Okiu, a basket of strawberry scones, to fortify you during these troubling times, as she put it. They say the Scotland Yard inspector found inconsistencies in Mr. Carmichael's statement, Mrs. Blackett confided, settling herself comfortably in Miss Marple's sitting room. And Sir William has been making accusations, claiming Richard never truly loved Diana, but was only after her family connections. "Family connections?" Miss Marple inquired, pouring tea for her visitor. "I was under the impression it was Sir William who needed the financial stability of the match." Mrs. Blackett leaned forward eagerly. "Well, that's what everyone thought. But my husband heard from Sir William's physician that the Laceys aren't nearly as financially stretched as they've let on. Sir William has been quite clever with some investments in South America. No, it seems the Carmichaels, despite their London address and fine clothes, are the ones in need of funds." Miss Marple digested this information thoughtfully. How interesting. And yet, if Mr. Carmichael needed the marriage for financial reasons, why would he harm Diana? Without her, there would be no advantageous match. Unless, Mrs. Blackett suggested with a meaningful look, she discovered something about him that made her threaten to call off the wedding, something scandalous enough to ruin him socially or professionally. After Mrs. Blackett departed, Miss Marple sat quietly, considering all she had learned. The receipt she had found near the gazebo remained. In her pocket, a nagging piece of evidence that didn't seem to fit anywhere in the puzzle yet. She decided a visit to the chemist in Much Benham might be illuminating. Just as she was preparing to leave, there was another knock at her door. This time, it was Alice, Diana's lady's maid, looking nervous and out of place in Miss Marple's cottage. Garden. Miss Marple, the young woman began hesitantly, Inspector Craddock suggested I speak with you. He said you might understand things that others wouldn't. How kind of him, Miss Marple replied, inviting the maid inside. And how can I help you, Alice? Once seated, the young woman twisted her handkerchief anxiously. It's about Miss Diana, ma'am. There's something I didn't tell the police because I was afraid it might make things worse for her when she's found. Miss Marple waited patiently as Alice gathered her courage. Miss Diana asked me to post a letter for her 2 days before the wedding. She was very particular that I should use the post box in Much Benham, not the one here in the village. And she made me promise not to tell anyone. I see, Miss Marple nodded. And did you happen to notice who the letter was addressed to? Alice hesitated. I didn't mean to look, truly, but as I was placing it in the box, I saw the name. It was addressed to a Mr. James Thornton at an address in London. Miss Marple's expression remained neutral, though her interest was piqued. The name means nothing to me. Did Diana ever mention this person? Never. Alice shook her head. But that's not all. The night before the wedding, after everyone had gone to bed, I saw Miss Diana slip out of the house. She was dressed in her day clothes, not her nightgown, and she had a small bag with her. She returned about an hour later, looking upset, I'd say, agitated. And you didn't mention this to the police? No, ma'am, Alice admitted. I was afraid they'd think she'd run away willingly, and from things I'd overheard, I knew that wasn't the case. Miss Diana was frightened of something, or someone, but she was determined to go through with the wedding. After Alice left, Miss Marple changed her plans. Instead of going to the chemist in Much Benham, she made her way to the vicarage to use the telephone. A brief call to an old school friend now living in London yielded the information that James Thornton was a solicitor specializing in financial crimes and fraud investigations. The afternoon was wearing on when Miss Marple finally arrived at the police station in Much Benham, where she found Inspector Craddock just emerging from an interview. Room. Miss Marple, he greeted her with a mixture of surprise and resignation. I might have known you'd find your way here. We've just finished questioning Mr. Carmichael. And have you charged him with anything? She inquired mildly. Not yet, Craddock admitted. His story about the flowers has fallen apart. The florist he claimed to visit wasn't even open at that hour. But he now says he was actually meeting with Edward Latimer to discuss wedding nerves, and Latimer confirms it. How convenient, Miss Marple observed. And what of the blood found in Diana's room? Craddock lowered his voice. We've identified it. It belongs to Alice, the lady's maid. She claims she cut her hand while helping Diana dress the day before and returned to clean the windowsill but must have missed a spot. I see, Miss Marple murmured. And you believe her? I'm not sure what to believe anymore, Craddock sighed. But Inspector Barnaby is focusing on Carmichael. The man has a strong motive if what we've learned about his finances is true. The Carmichael shipping business is apparently on the verge of bankruptcy. They need the Lacey connection and money, desperately. That would certainly provide motive, Miss Marple agreed. But have you discovered anything about Diana's activities the night before she disappeared? Did she have any visitors, perhaps, or make any telephone calls? Craddock gave her a sharp look. What do you know, Miss Marple? Very little, she replied, innocently. I'm merely wondering if Diana might have been meeting someone that night, someone who perhaps had information that would impact her decision to marry. Before Craddock could respond, Inspector Barnaby emerged from the interview room, his stern face set in lines of frustration. "We're releasing Carmichael for now," he informed Craddock, "but he's not to leave the area." Noticing Miss Marple, he frowned. "And who might this be?" After introductions were made, and Miss Marple's connection to previous cases explained, much to her modest embarrassment, she found herself invited to share what she knew. She mentioned Alice's information about the letter to James Thornton, and Diana's mysterious excursion the night before the wedding, but kept the receipt she'd found to herself for the time being. A fraud investigator? Barnaby's interest was immediately piqued. That's certainly suggestive, given what we've learned about Carmichael's business dealings. I'll have someone visit Thornton's office immediately. As Miss Marple left the police station, she spotted Edward Latimer waiting in a parked car across the street. As Richard Carmichael emerged, looking haggard but relieved, the two men had a brief, intense conversation before driving away. Miss Marple noticed that rather than heading back toward St. Mary Mead, their car turned in the direction of London. Evening was falling as Miss Marple finally visited the chemist in Much Benham, where she showed the receipt she had found to the pharmacist, a middle-aged woman with a practical air. "Oh, yes," the pharmacist confirmed, examining the paper. "I remember this. Young lady, very elegant, nervous sort. Bought sleeping tablets and a pregnancy test kit. Paid cash." "I see," Miss Marple said quietly. "And can you recall what this young lady looked like?" "Tall, dark-haired, expensive clothes. She was wearing sunglasses, even though it was a cloudy day." The pharmacist hesitated. "Actually, now that I think of it, she seemed familiar, though I couldn't place her at the time." As Miss Marple made her way back to St. Mary Mead on the evening bus, her mind was working steadily, piecing together the disparate fragments of information. A bride who disappeared, a fiancé with financial troubles, a letter to a fraud investigator, a midnight excursion, and now, perhaps most significantly, a pregnancy test kit. The pattern was beginning to take shape, though crucial pieces were still missing. Chapter 5. A Telling Detail. The following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to startling news. Diana Lacey's silver compact had been found in the woods bordering Gossington Hall, along with traces of blood on the surrounding leaves. This discovery, coming 3 days after the bride's disappearance, cast an even darker shadow over the village. Miss Marple learned of this development from Inspector Craddock, who stopped by her cottage shortly after breakfast. "The blood appears fresh," he informed her gravely, accepting a cup of tea. "Inspector Barnaby has ordered a wider search of the woodland area. He's convinced we're looking at foul play now." "And Mr. Carmichael?" Miss Marple inquired. "I noticed his car heading toward London yesterday evening." "Returned late last night, according to our surveillance," Craddock replied. "Claimed he and—" Latimer went to consult with their solicitor about potential slander from Sir William. "We've verified the meeting took place." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And has there been any word from Mr. Thornton, the fraud investigator Diana contacted?" "That's partly why I'm here," Craddock said, leaning forward. "Thornton confirms receiving a letter from Diana approximately a week ago. She requested a meeting, which took place 2 nights before the wedding. According to Thornton, Diana brought financial documents related to Carmichael's shipping that suggested serious irregularities, possibly embezzlement. How did Diana come by such documents? Miss Marple wondered aloud. Thornton wasn't sure, but he believed she'd found them in Richard's briefcase. She was concerned about marrying into a family involved in illegal activities. Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. So Diana discovered her fiancé might be involved in financial misconduct, consulted a fraud investigator, and then disappeared on her wedding day. It does paint a concerning picture of Mr. Carmichael's potential involvement. Indeed, Craddock agreed. Barnaby is building a case against him, though he hesitated. Without more concrete evidence, it remains circumstantial. After Craddock left, Miss Marple put on her hat and gloves and made her way to the village high street. Rather than joining the crowd gathered outside the police station where updates on the search were being provided, she slipped into the small florist shop where Mrs. Ellison, a talkative woman with a prodigious memory for details, presided over arrangements for the church altar. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Ellison greeted her. "Terrible business about the Lacey girl, isn't it? And now, with them finding her compact in the woods, well, I hardly dare think what they'll find next." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Mrs. Ellison, I wonder if you recall seeing Miss Lacey in your shop recently. Perhaps in the week before the wedding?" Mrs. Ellison's brow furrowed in concentration. "Let me think. Yes, she came in on Tuesday. That would be 3 days before the wedding. Ordered a special bouquet of white roses and forget-me-nots. Said it was for her mother's grave, which she wanted to visit before the ceremony." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple murmured. "Did she seem troubled to you?" "Now you mention it. She did seem preoccupied. Jumped when the bell rang as someone else entered the shop." Mrs. Ellison leaned closer. "It was that friend of hers, Pamela. They left together, talking very seriously." This piece of information gave Miss Marple pause. Pamela had not mentioned meeting Diana at the florist, nor accompanying her to her mother's grave, if indeed that was where they had gone. Her next stop was the church, where the aged sexton was sweeping the path. After some gentle questioning, Miss Marple learned that he had indeed seen Diana and Pamela in the churchyard on Tuesday afternoon, but they had not visited Mrs. Lacey's grave. Instead, they had spent some time in the old section, among graves, dating back centuries. Looking at the Carmichael family plot, they were, the sexton told her. Old family around these parts, the Carmichaels, though the current lot moved to London 2 generations back. Still have their reserved plot, though, maintained by the estate. Miss Marple thanked him and wandered slowly toward the section he had indicated. The Carmichael family plot was well maintained, with recent flowers placed before several of the older headstones. What had Diana been looking for here? As she carefully examined the inscriptions, a small detail caught her eye on one of the newer stones, dated just 3 years earlier. Elizabeth Carmichael, beloved wife of Thomas, mother of Richard and Rose, gone too soon. It was not the inscription itself that gave Miss Marple pause, but rather the small symbol carved beneath it, a tiny butterfly, almost unnoticeable unless one was looking carefully. She had seen that same symbol before, not 2 days ago, sketched absently in the margin of a notepad on Pamela Brewster's bedside table when she had visited Gossington Hall to speak with Sir William. Miss Marple stood very still, her mind working rapidly. Richard had a sister named Rose, whom no one had mentioned. Elizabeth Carmichael had died 3 years ago, and the butterfly symbol connected Pamela to this family somehow. Returning to the village, Miss Marple made a detour to the post office, where Mrs. Blade could be relied upon for information about the comings and goings of parcels and people alike. "Mrs. Blade," Miss Marple began casually, "do you recall if Miss Brewster, Diana's friend from Switzerland, has received any mail during her stay in the village?" Mrs. Blade's eyes lit up at the prospect of sharing information. "As a matter of fact, she has. Several letters from London, and one telegram that arrived the day before the wedding. Seemed quite upset about it. She did. I see, Miss Marple murmured. And the letters? Were they addressed to Pamela Brewster? That's the odd thing, Mrs. Blade replied, lowering her voice conspiratorially. They were addressed to Rose Carmichael, care of Pamela Brewster. I assumed it was some arrangement they had. Miss Marple thanked her and walked slowly back to her cottage, the pieces of the puzzle shifting and realigning in her mind. The butterfly on Elizabeth Carmichael's grave. The letters addressed to Rose Carmichael. Pamela's nervousness and her apparent relief when Diana disappeared. A theory was forming, one that explained many of the inconsistencies in the case. But Miss Marple needed one more piece of information to confirm her suspicions. And for that, she would need to speak with Sir William Lacy himself. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Revelations. Gaining an audience with Sir William proved more difficult than Miss Marple anticipated. Gossington Hall was now under police guard, with Inspector Barnaby having established a temporary headquarters in the library. When Miss Marple arrived, she found the grounds bustling with constables conducting a methodical search of the estate. I'm afraid Sir William isn't seeing visitors, the officer at the door informed her firmly. Inspector's orders. Fortune favored her, however, when Inspector Craddock emerged from the house and spotted her at the gate. Miss Marple, he called, coming over. What brings you here? She explained her desire to speak with Sir William about a matter that might be relevant to the case. Craddock hesitated, then lowered his voice. Barnaby won't like it, but I think your instincts are worth following. Sir William is in his study. I'll take you through the side entrance. Once inside, Miss Marple found Sir William a changed man from the proud father she had observed at the church days earlier. His face was haggard, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled. He sat behind his desk, a tumbler of brandy at his elbow despite the early hour. Miss Marple, he acknowledged wearily. Craddock says you have questions. I don't see how they could possibly help find my daughter, but I'm at my wit's end. Sir William, Miss Marple began gently, I'd like to ask about Diana's childhood. Did she ever know the Carmichael family before her engagement to Richard? The question seemed to surprise him. No, they were introduced at a London dinner party. Last autumn. The families had no prior connection that I'm aware of. I see. And what about Pamela Brewster? How long has she been Diana's friend? Sir William frowned. They met at school in Switzerland 4 years ago. Diana wasn't particularly close with anyone before that. She was a rather solitary child after her mother died. He took a sip of brandy. Why do you ask about Pamela? One last question, if I may, Miss Marple continued, gently sidestepping his inquiry. The butterfly symbol on Elizabeth Carmichael's gravestone, does it hold any significance that you know of? Sir William's eyebrows rose in genuine bewilderment. Elizabeth Carmichael? I never met the woman. And what butterfly symbol? What does this have to do with Diana? Miss Marple thanked him for his time and was escorted from the house by Craddock, to whom she confided some of her suspicions. I need to speak with Pamela Brewster immediately, she concluded. Where might I find her? She's staying at the Blue Boar now, Craddock informed her. Moved out of Gossington Hall yesterday at Barnaby's request. He's been questioning all the house guests separately. The Blue Boar was St. Mary Mead's only inn, a low-beamed establishment that rarely hosted visitors. Beyond the occasional commercial traveler, Miss Marple found Pamela in the small private parlor, writing letters. The young woman looked up in surprise as Miss Marple entered. Miss Marple, what brings you here? I think you know, Miss Carmichael, Miss Marple replied quietly, taking a seat opposite her. The color drained from Pamela's face. For a moment, she appeared ready to deny it. Then her shoulders slumped in resignation. "How did you know?" she asked softly. "The butterfly symbol on your mother's grave," Miss Marple explained. "You drew it absently on your notepad. A habit, I suspect. And then there were the letters addressed to Rose Carmichael in your care. You are Rose Carmichael, Richard's sister, are you not?" Pamela, or rather Rose, nodded slowly. "Yes. But how did you know about the letters?" "Mrs. Blade at the post office is very observant," Miss Marple said with a small smile. "What I don't understand is why the deception. Why pose as Diana's school friend?" Rose twisted her hands nervously. "It's complicated. Richard didn't want anyone to know I was his sister. He said it would raise too many questions." "About what happened 3 years ago?" Miss Marple suggested gently. Rose's eyes widened. "You know about that too? I know your mother died 3 years ago, and that something about her death connects to Diana's disappearance." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Please, my dear, what really happened to Diana?" Tears filled Rose's eyes. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt. When Richard told me he was engaged to Diana Lacey, I was shocked. Of all the women in England, he had to choose her. It couldn't be coincidence. You knew Diana before?" "Not exactly." Rose took a deep breath. 3 years ago, my mother was killed in a hit-and-run accident in London. The driver was never found, but Richard became obsessed with finding them. He hired private investigators, offered rewards. Nothing. Until? Miss Marple prompted. Until last autumn, when one of his investigators made a connection. The car that killed our mother had been rented under a false name, but they traced the payment back to a bank account connected to— She hesitated. Connected to Sir William Lacey. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, though her eyes sharpened. "And so Richard orchestrated a meeting with Diana?" "Yes." Rose nodded miserably. "He was convinced Sir William had been driving the car, or knew who was. He planned to get close to Diana, gain her trust, and eventually access to Sir William's papers and correspondences from that time." "Did Diana know any of this?" "No, not initially. Richard genuinely grew to care for her, I think. But then she found some of his investigation notes in his briefcase." Rose wiped away a tear. "That's when she contacted that fraud investigator. She must have misunderstood what she found. Thought it was about financial irregularities." "And when did you enter the picture as Pamela Brewster?" "Richard asked me to come just before the wedding, to help manage things. Diana was asking questions, growing suspicious. I was supposed to be her trusted friend, someone she would confide in." Rose looked down in shame. "I hated the deception. But Richard is my brother. Our mother deserved justice. And the night before the wedding?" "What happened?" Miss Marple pressed. "Diana confronted Richard. She'd put it all together. His real reason for pursuing her. The investigation into her father. She threatened to call off the wedding and expose him." Rose's voice dropped to a whisper. "Richard was furious. I've never seen him like that before." "And did you see Diana after that confrontation?" Rose hesitated, then nodded slowly. "She came to my room very late, looking terrified. She said she needed to disappear, that she wasn't safe. She asked for my help." "And did you help her?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Before Rose could answer, the door to the parlor burst open, and Richard Carmichael stood in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury. "That's quite enough, Rose," he said softly. "You've said too much already." Chapter 7. An Unexpected Turn. "Richard," Rose gasped, rising to her feet. "I was just—" "Betraying family confidences to a village busybody," Richard finished coldly, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. He turned to Miss Marple, his expression carefully controlled. "I apologize for my sister's imagination. She's always been prone to dramatics." Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "It didn't sound like imagination to me, Mr. Carmichael. In fact, it explained rather a lot about this case." Richard's jaw tightened. "There is no case, Miss Marple. There is only my missing fiancé, whom I'm desperate to find." "As desperate as you were to find your mother's killer?" Miss Marple asked mildly. For a moment, genuine grief flickered across Richard's face before he masked it. "My mother's death was a tragic accident." "A hit and run is hardly an accident," Miss Marple observed, "and pursuing the daughter of the man you suspected was responsible hardly suggests you've made peace with it." Richard stared at her, then at his sister, calculating. Finally he sighed and took a seat. "What do you want, Miss Marple?" "The truth about what happened to Diana," she replied simply. "I don't know," Richard admitted, and for the first time, genuine distress showed in his expression. "After our argument, I assumed she'd call off the wedding. I was prepared for that. But then the next morning, she was just gone. Not even a confrontation. Just vanished." "You didn't harm her?" Miss Marple pressed. "No," Richard stated firmly. "Whatever you may think of my motives for pursuing her, I would never hurt Diana. In fact—" He hesitated, glancing at his sister. "In fact, what?" Miss Marple prompted. "In fact, despite everything, I had grown to care for her," Richard admitted. "The revenge plot seems childish now. I was going to tell her everything after the honeymoon, try to make a fresh start." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "And yet, Diana believed she wasn't safe. She came to your sister in fear." Before Richard could respond, there was a commotion outside. The parlor door opened again to reveal Inspector Barnaby, accompanied by 2 constables. "Richard Carmichael," Barnaby announced formally. "I'm arresting you on suspicion of the abduction and possible murder of Diana Lacey." "What?" Richard stood up, shock evident on his face. "On what grounds?" "We've found traces of blood in the boot of your car," Barnaby replied grimly, "and fibers matching Diana's dressing gown. Inspector Craddock is currently executing a search warrant on your London residence." As the constables moved to handcuff Richard, Miss Marple spoke up. "Inspector, I believe there may be more to this case than appears. I've just learned." "With respect, Miss Marple," Barnaby cut her off. "We have physical evidence now. Mr. Carmichael's car was thoroughly cleaned recently, but our forensic team found traces that couldn't be removed. I lent my car to Edward." "Day before yesterday," Richard protested as the handcuffs were fastened. "He said he needed to run errands. Ask him." "Mr. Latimer left for London this morning," Barnaby informed him coldly. "When we attempted to contact him at his office, we discovered he'd booked passage on a ship to New York, departing tomorrow." This news seemed to shock Richard more than his own arrest. "Edward is leaving the country? That's impossible. Our business is on the verge of collapse," Barnaby finished. "Yes, we know all about Carmichael Shipping's financial troubles. It seems Mr. Latimer decided to abandon the sinking ship." As Richard was led away, still protesting his innocence, Miss Marple and Rose were left alone in the parlor. The young woman looked shell-shocked. "Do you believe him?" Miss Marple asked gently. "About not harming Diana?" Rose nodded slowly. Richard has a temper, but he's not violent, and he genuinely came to care for Diana. That's why this whole revenge plan troubled him so much toward the end. He was caught between his feelings for her and his loyalty to our mother's memory. And Mr. Latimer? What do you know of him? Edward? Rose frowned slightly. He and Richard have been friends since university. He joined the family business about 5 years ago when our father's health began to fail. He was devoted to my mother. Devoted? Miss Marple picked up on the slight emphasis. Rose looked uncomfortable. There were rumors. My father traveled frequently, and Edward was often at the house. I was away at school most of the time, but Richard once mentioned that he suspected Edward and our mother might have been close. Miss Marple considered this new information carefully. And Edward accompanied Richard throughout his courtship. Of Diana? Yes, Rose confirmed. He encouraged it, actually. When Richard began having doubts about using Diana to get to her father, Edward reminded him of our mother, of how she'd died alone on that street. She trailed off, lost in painful memories. Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly, connecting threads that had seemed disparate before. Did Diana ever meet Edward before her engagement to Richard? Rose thought for a moment. I don't believe so. Why? Just curious, Miss Marple murmured. She rose to her feet. My dear, I think you should speak with Inspector Craddock as soon as possible. Tell him everything you've told me about your mother's death and Richard's investigation. Will it help Richard? Perhaps. But more importantly, it might help us find Diana, if she's still alive. After leaving Rose at the Blue Boar, Miss Marple made her way to the chemist shop in St. Mary Mead. There she asked to use their telephone and placed a call to her old friend at Scotland Yard, Inspector Slack, now retired but still well-connected. Thomas, she said when he answered, I need information about a hit-and-run in London from 3 years ago. The victim was Elizabeth Carmichael. She listened for a moment, then added, Yes, it's connected to a case here in St. Mary Mead. And Thomas, I'd be particularly interested in any witnesses who came forward at the time. After completing her call, Miss Marple stood on the high street, watching as a police car drove by, presumably taking Richard Carmichael to the county jail. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting again, forming a new pattern that was disturbing in its implications. Her next stop would be Gossington Hall once more, but this time she needed to speak with someone she had previously overlooked. Mrs. Henderson, Diana's former nanny, who might have insights into the family that no one else possessed. Insights that might reveal where Diana had gone, if indeed she had fled of her own accord. Chapter 8. A calculated risk, Mrs. Henderson was a small, bird-like woman with sharp eyes that had missed little during her decades of service to the Lacey family. Miss Marple found her in the housekeeper's room at Gossington Hall, folding linens, with practiced efficiency despite the chaos of the police investigation taking place throughout the house. Miss Marple, the nanny acknowledged with a nod. I wondered when you'd come to see me. You were expecting me? Miss Marple asked, surprised. Mrs. Henderson's thin lips curved into a knowing smile. When strange things happen in this village, you're never far behind. Like that business with the vicar's wife and the missing painting last year. You're very observant, Mrs. Henderson. Miss Marple settled into a chair by the small fireplace. It's that quality I was hoping to draw upon today, about Diana. It wasn't a question. Yes, you've known her since she was a child. Would she have run away? Mrs. Henderson carefully placed a folded sheet in the linen cupboard before answering. Diana was always a sensible girl, even as a child. Quiet, thoughtful, Not the type for dramatic gestures. She paused. But she was her mother's daughter in one respect, fiercely protective of those she loved. Her mother, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. I understand she died when Diana was quite young. Lady Lacy died 15 years ago. Cancer. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened. Diana was only 12, but she sat by her mother's bedside for weeks, reading to her, holding her hand. She grew up quickly after that. And Sir William? How did he cope with the loss? A shadow crossed Mrs. Henderson's face. Not well at first. There was drinking, erratic behavior. He took Diana to Switzerland for a time. Said the mountain air would do her good, but really, I think he needed to escape the memories here. And when they returned, Sir William was changed, more focused, determined. That's when he began his business ventures in South America. As for Diana, she was sent to finishing school in Switzerland. She came home rarely after that, until her engagement. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Mrs. Henderson, do you recall if Diana ever mentioned meeting Edward Latimer before her engagement to Richard? The nanny looked startled. Mr. Latimer? Not that I recall. Why do you ask? Just fitting pieces together, Miss Marple replied mildly. One last question. Did Diana ever speak to you about her concerns regarding her fiancé? Perhaps in the days leading up to the wedding? Mrs. Henderson hesitated, then sighed. The night before she disappeared, Diana came to my room. She was troubled, said she'd discovered something terrible about Richard and his friend. She didn't elaborate, but she asked me a strange question. What question? Miss Marple prompted, when the nanny fell silent. She asked if I still had the key to the old gamekeeper's cottage on the north edge of the estate. It's been abandoned for years, but Diana used to play there as a child. I gave her my key. I didn't think it important until she vanished. Did you mention this to the police? I told Inspector Barnaby yesterday when they found her compact. He sent men to search the cottage immediately, but they found nothing. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Henderson and departed with much to consider. On her way out of Gossington Hall, she encountered Inspector Craddock, who looked harried and frustrated. Any progress? She inquired. Barnaby's convinced Carmichael is our man, especially with Latimer fleeing, Craddock replied. But something doesn't add up. Why would Diana go to the old cottage if she feared Richard? And why would Richard keep evidence in his car for days after allegedly abducting her? Valid questions, Miss Marple agreed. Has there been any response from your inquiries about witnesses to Elizabeth Carmichael's hit and run? Craddock looked surprised. How did you know about that? Yes, actually. There was one witness, a street vendor who saw the accident but couldn't identify the driver. The vendor gave a statement but disappeared before the inquest. The police suspected he'd been paid off. Interesting, Miss Marple murmured. And Edward Latimer? Have you found anything connecting him directly to Diana? Nothing so far, although Craddock's brow furrowed. We did find something odd in Diana's room, a torn photograph in the back of her jewelry box. It shows a younger Diana with a man whose face is obscured. The photo appears to have been taken in Switzerland, judging by the mountain backdrop. Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. The pieces were aligning in her mind, forming a pattern that pointed to a startling conclusion. But she needed confirmation. Inspector, I believe I know where Diana might be, or, at least, where we might find answers. Where? Craddock asked eagerly. The old mill, Miss Marple replied. Not the pond, but the mill itself. It's been abandoned for decades, but it would provide shelter, and it's sufficiently isolated. The mill has already been searched, Craddock objected. Perhaps not thoroughly enough, Miss Marple suggested, and I think we should search it again tonight, with one small difference. What difference? I think word should reach Edward Latimer that something significant has been found at the mill, something connecting him to Diana's disappearance. But the information should appear to come from an indiscreet constable, not officially from the police. Craddock stared at her. You think Latimer will return to St. Mary Mead if he believes there's evidence against him? I think he'll have no choice, Miss Marple said firmly, particularly if the rumor mentions documents Diana left behind. After some persuasion, Craddock agreed to Miss Marple's plan. By evening, a carefully crafted rumor had been accidentally let slip at the Blue Boar by a young constable, that papers found at the old mill suggested a connection between Diana Lacey and Edward Latimer predating her engagement to Richard. Miss Marple, wrapped in a warm coat against the evening chill, took up her position in the shadows of the old mill's lower level. Inspector Craddock and 2 officers concealed themselves nearby. The mill stood dark and silent on the outskirts of the village, its weathered timber creaking occasionally in the night breeze. It was nearly midnight when they heard the sound of a car approaching cautiously, its headlights extinguished as it came up the overgrown drive. The engine stopped, and a door opened and closed quietly. Miss Marple tensed as footsteps crunched on the gravel outside, moving with purpose toward the mill entrance. She had calculated correctly. Someone had taken the bait. But would it be Edward Latimer, as she suspected? And more importantly, would he lead them to Diana Lacey, dead or alive? The mill door creaked open, and a shadowy figure slipped inside, flashlight beams sweeping the dusty interior. Miss Marple pressed herself further into the shadow of an old grain bin, her heart racing as the beam of light came closer. The trap was set. Now they would discover the truth about the vanishing bride. Chapter 9. The trap is sprung. The beam of light swept across the mill's interior, illuminating ancient machinery and cobwebbed corners. Miss Marple remained perfectly still as the footsteps drew nearer, dust motes dancing in the flashlights. Beam! The intruder moved with purpose, searching methodically, muttering under their breath. When the light suddenly swung toward her hiding place, Miss Marple did not flinch. Instead, she stepped forward deliberately, allowing herself to be seen. "Good evening," she said calmly. "I've been expecting you." The beam froze, then settled on her face. Behind it stood not Edward Latimer, but Mildred Lacey, Sir William's sister-in-law, her normally severe features contorted with shock. "Miss Marple?" she gasped. "What are you doing here?" Before Miss Marple could respond, there was a commotion at the mill entrance. Inspector Craddock and his officers burst in, flashlights blazing. Mildred spun around, momentarily blinded by the sudden light. "Mildred Lacey," Craddock announced, "we'd like you to accompany us to the station to answer some questions about Diana's disappearance." Mildred's composure crumbled. "I don't know anything about that. I came here because I heard rumors that Diana had left something. Letters, documents, family matters that shouldn't become public." "And why would such documents concern you?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "I've been part of this family for 15 years, Mildred replied defensively. "I care about the Lacey reputation." "Yet you moved rather quickly to search Diana's room after she disappeared," Miss Marple observed. "And you've been removing items from Gossington Hall in that large handbag of yours." Mildred's face flushed. "I was merely securing family valuables. With all these police and strangers about—" She was interrupted by another set of footsteps entering the mill. Everyone turned to see Edward Latimer standing in the doorway, his expression shifting from determination to alarm at the scene before him. "Ah, Mr. Latimer," Miss Marple greeted him as though his arrival was expected. "How fortunate. Now we can address both of you at once." "I don't understand," Edward began, his eyes darting between Mildred, the police, and Miss Marple. "I received a message that Diana had left something here. A fabrication, I'm afraid," Miss Marple informed him, "designed to bring out anyone with a guilty conscience regarding Diana's disappearance. And it appears to have worked twice over," Craddock added grimly, signaling his officers to secure both Mildred and Edward. "This is absurd," Edward protested. "I came back from London as soon as I heard Richard had been arrested. I knew he was innocent." "Yet you were planning to sail to New York tomorrow," Craddock pointed out. "A business trip scheduled months ago. I was going to cancel it. But then all this happened, and I thought perhaps some distance might be wise, until the misunderstanding was cleared up." "A misunderstanding that involves blood in Richard's car?" Miss Marple inquired. "The car you borrowed 2 days ago?" Edward's face paled. "I can explain that. I had a nosebleed, a chronic condition. I thought I'd cleaned it up. And the fibers matching Diana's dressing gown? I don't know anything about that," Edward stammered. "Perhaps I can clarify matters," came a new voice from the shadows at the back of the mill. Everyone turned in surprise as Inspector Barnaby stepped forward, accompanied by a constable. And behind them, to general astonishment, stood Diana Lacey. She was dressed simply in a dark skirt and sweater, her face pale but composed. She looked thinner than at the church days earlier, with shadows under her eyes suggesting little sleep. But she was very much alive. "Diana!" Mildred gasped. "Where have you been? We've been frantic." "I doubt that, Aunt Mildred," Diana replied coldly, "considering you've been searching my room and the estate for what I took from your desk." "And what was that, Miss Lacey?" Inspector Barnaby prompted. "Letters," Diana answered, her gaze fixed on her aunt. "Letters that proved Aunt Mildred was in London the day Elizabeth Carmichael was killed, driving my father's car, which she had taken without permission. Letters from Edward Latimer threatening to expose her if she didn't help him." Edward lunged forward, but was restrained by the officers. "You little fool! You have no idea what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Diana continued, her voice gaining strength. "When I met Richard, I had no idea who he was, but when he introduced me to Edward, I recognized him immediately, though he didn't remember me. He'd visited my Swiss school years ago, asking questions about my father's movements during the time of his mother's death." "So, you knew about Richard's investigation?" Miss Marple asked. Diana nodded. "Not at first. I fell in love with Richard genuinely. It was only when I found his notes that I realized his initial motive for pursuing me. But by then, I'd also discovered something far worse." She turned to face Edward directly. "You were in love with Elizabeth Carmichael, and when she rejected you for the final time, you arranged for her death, but made it appear that my father was responsible." "Preposterous!" Edward snarled. "You can't prove any of this." "Perhaps not entirely," Miss Marple interjected calmly. "But there are certain facts that point in that direction. The witness to Mrs. Carmichael's accident, who mysteriously disappeared before the inquest, he was paid off, wasn't he, Mr. Latimer? Not by Sir William, but by you. And then you manipulated Richard's grief," Diana continued, "encouraging his investigation, carefully directing his suspicions toward my father. You even orchestrated our chance meeting." "But why?" Inspector Craddock asked. "What would be gained by having Richard marry you?" "The perfect revenge," Miss Marple answered. "Richard would marry into the family he believed responsible for, his mother's death, destroying both families in the process once the truth was revealed. And Mr. Latimer would have his vengeance on both the woman who rejected him and the man he falsely blamed. "It's all conjecture," Edward insisted, though his face had grown increasingly ashen. "Not entirely," Diana replied. "I found your old letters to Elizabeth in Aunt Mildred's desk. And then there's the witness who saw Aunt Mildred driving my father's car in London that day, the witness whose silence you bought, but who kept evidence of the transaction." Edward's eyes darted to Mildred, who had gone very still. "You told me you destroyed everything," he hissed. "I kept insurance," Mildred replied tightly, "in case you ever turned on me." As the two suspects began to turn on each other, Inspector Barnaby stepped forward. "We'll continue this discussion at the station. Miss Lacey has already provided a full statement about her disappearance and the events leading up to it." As Mildred and Edward were led away, Diana approached Miss Marple. "How did you know?" she asked quietly. "About the mill, about all of it." "Various small details," Miss Marple replied. "The butterfly symbol on Elizabeth Carmichael's grave, a marker often used by lovers. The way Edward encouraged Richard's revenge plan, and your purchase of a pregnancy test kit, which suggested urgency in your decision-making." Diana's hand moved instinctively to her stomach. "Yes," she whispered. "I couldn't let my child be born into such a web of hatred and lies. When I realized the danger I was in, that both Edward and my aunt might go to any lengths to prevent me from exposing them, I knew I had to disappear until I could safely bring the truth to light. And so you went to the gamekeeper's cottage first, then slipped away to the mill," Miss Marple concluded. "A place you knew from childhood, where you could observe the investigation from a distance." Diana nodded. "Inspector Barnaby found me yesterday. I'd finally gathered the courage to contact him directly." She glanced toward the mill entrance. "And Richard? Will he be released now?" "I imagine so," Miss Marple said gently. "Though there remains the matter of his original deception regarding your courtship." Diana's expression softened. "Yes, we have much to discuss, Richard and I. But first, I need to see my father." As they left the mill, the first hints of dawn were lighting the eastern sky. The village of St. Mary Mead slept on, unaware that the mystery of the vanishing bride had been solved, and that the truth, as Miss Marple had suspected all along, had been hidden beneath layers of deception, revenge, and unexpected love. Chapter 10. The Threads. Unravel, the news of Diana Lacey's safe return spread through St. Mary Mead with remarkable speed. By mid-morning, villagers gathered in small clusters along the high street, exchanging theories and expressions of relief. The drama that had begun with an empty place at the altar was now evolving into something far more complex. Miss Marple, having given her statement to Inspector Barnaby, returned to her cottage for a much-needed rest. She had just settled in her garden with a cup of tea when Inspector Craddock appeared at her gate. "May I join you?" he asked, removing his hat. "I thought you might like to know the latest developments." "Please do," Miss Marple replied, gesturing to the chair opposite. "I was just thinking about poor Richard Carmichael." "He's been released," Craddock confirmed, accepting the tea Cherry brought out. "All charges dropped. He's currently at Gossington Hall with Diana and Sir William." "A difficult reunion, I imagine," Miss Marple observed. "Indeed, but not nearly as difficult as the questioning of Edward Latimer and Mildred Lacey. They've been at each other's throats since we brought them in, each trying to shift the blame." "And what have they revealed?" Miss Marple inquired. Craddock leaned forward. "It seems your deductions were remarkably accurate. Edward Latimer was obsessed with Elizabeth Carmichael for years. They had a brief affair while her husband was away, on business, but she ended it. Edward couldn't accept the rejection. And so he arranged the hit and run, Miss Marple concluded. Yes, though he didn't drive the car himself. That was Mildred's role, though she claims she didn't know the plan was to kill Elizabeth. She thought they were just going to frighten her. And how did Mildred become involved in such a scheme? Craddock sipped his tea before answering. That's where it gets interesting. Mildred had her own obsession. With Sir William. She'd been in love with him since before he married her sister. When her sister died, she moved into Gossington Hall, hoping Sir William would eventually see her as more than a sister-in-law. But he never did, Miss Marple murmured. No, and when Sir William began showing interest in another woman a few years ago, Elizabeth Carmichael? Miss Marple interrupted, her eyebrows rising. Craddock nodded. Exactly. They met at a charity function in London. Nothing came of it. Sir William was still too devoted to his late wife's memory. But the mere possibility drove Mildred to a jealous rage. When Edward Latimer approached her with his plan to frighten Elizabeth, she agreed readily. And afterward, when they realized what they'd done, Edward saw an opportunity. He convinced Mildred to steal items from Sir William's desk, his calendar, appointment book, certain personal effects, to plant in the rental car before abandoning it. The plan was to implicate Sir William if the police investigation got too close. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And then Edward cultivated his friendship with Richard, nurturing his grief and directing his suspicions toward Sir William. A meticulous plan spanning years, Craddock agreed. Edward even established legitimate business ties with Carmichael Shipping to get closer to Richard. He was the one who suggested Richard investigate his mother's death when the police investigation stalled. And he was the one who orchestrated the chance meeting between Richard and Diana, Miss Marple added. Yes, though, as Diana told us, Richard genuinely fell in love with her, complicating Edward's revenge scheme. Miss Marple sat down, her teacup. What happened the night before the wedding? When Diana confronted Richard? According to both their statements, Diana had found Edward's old letters to Elizabeth hidden in Mildred's room while looking for a borrowed shawl. She recognized his handwriting on some of Richard's investigation notes and put it together. She confronted Richard, who was genuinely shocked. He'd had no idea of Edward's personal connection to his mother. And after their argument, Diana returned to her room, intending to cancel the wedding the next morning. But then she overheard Edward and Mildred arguing in the library about what to do if Diana exposed them. Edward suggested they might need to silence her. That's when Diana decided to disappear. A wise decision, Miss Marple commented. And the blood in her room? Alice's, as we established, Craddock confirmed, but deliberately placed there by Mildred to suggest foul play. Mildred hoped the investigation would focus on Richard while she searched for the letters Diana had taken. The letters that proved her presence in London the day of the hit and run, Miss Marple mused. And what of Diana's pregnancy? Has she shared that news with Richard? Craddock looked surprised. How did you— Never mind. Yes, she has. It was the first thing she told him after his release. Despite everything, they seem determined to work through this together. Young love can be remarkably resilient, Miss Marple observed with a small smile. As Craddock departed, promising to keep her informed of further developments, Miss Marple remained in her garden, contemplating the complex web of human emotions that had led to this point. Obsession, rejection, jealousy, revenge, and ultimately, love. The patterns were familiar to her, echoes of human nature she had observed throughout her long life. The afternoon sun cast lengthening shadows across her garden as she considered the players in this drama. Edward Latimer, whose obsessive love had twisted into something dark and destructive. Mildred Lacey, whose unrequited feelings had made her vulnerable to manipulation. Richard Carmichael, who had begun a courtship in deception but found genuine love. And Diana, whose courage and clear thinking had ultimately saved her life and exposed the truth. As Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to go inside, she wondered what would come of Richard and Diana. Could a relationship founded on such complicated deception ever truly flourish? Perhaps, she thought, if the foundation of genuine feeling was strong enough. After all, the human heart had a remarkable capacity for forgiveness, even in the face of extraordinary circumstances. Chapter 11. Confrontations and Confessions. The following day brought heavy rain to St. Mary Mead, keeping most villagers indoors and lending a somber atmosphere to proceedings. Miss Marple had just finished her morning correspondence when there was a knock at her door. Cherry ushered in Richard Carmichael, looking tired but determined. "Miss Marple," he began, declining her offer of tea, "I wanted to thank you personally. If you hadn't uncovered Edward's plot, I might still be sitting in a cell, accused of harming the woman I love." "You're very welcome, Mr. Carmichael, Missy Dodru," Marple replied, studying him with shrewd eyes. "Though I must say, your initial deception of Diana hardly paints you in a favorable light." Richard winced. "I know. It was unforgivable. When I began, I was consumed by grief for my mother and manipulated by Edward. Though that's no excuse. I truly intended to reveal everything to Diana after the honeymoon and face the consequences, whatever they might be." "And now," Miss Marple inquired, "what are your intentions?" "Diana has agreed to give me a second chance," Richard said, a mixture of wonder and gratitude in his voice. "We're going to postpone any wedding plans until the baby is born and we've had time to rebuild. Trust. I've told her everything about my mother, about Edward's influence, about my changing feelings. No more secrets. A wise approach," Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "And your sister, Rose, will she be returning to her true identity?" "Yes. She's at Gossington Hall now, getting to know Diana properly. They've taken to each other remarkably well, considering the circumstances." After Richard left, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to Gossington Hall herself. The rain had lightened to a fine mist as she made her way along the village lane. The grounds of the great house were quiet, the police presence greatly reduced. Now that the case was essentially solved, Diana and Rose were having tea in the conservatory, a bright spot against the gray day. They greeted Miss Marple warmly, insisting she join them. "I was just telling Rose about my hideout at the mill," Diana explained, pouring tea for Miss Marple. "It wasn't pleasant, but I managed. I had supplies I'd hidden there the night before, and I could observe the comings and goings on the estate from a distance." "A clever choice," Miss Marple commented. "Not the first place anyone would look, yet close enough to keep informed." "I considered leaving the area entirely," Diana admitted. "But I needed to gather evidence against Edward and Aunt Mildred before I did. I knew no one would believe my accusations without proof." "The letters you took from your aunt's desk?" Miss Marple asked. Diana nodded. "And other documents. Edward had kept souvenirs of his relationship with Elizabeth Carmichael. Photographs, ticket stubs, hotel receipts. Mildred had found them during one of her searches and kept them as leverage. I found them hidden in a false bottom of her jewelry box." "And the pregnancy test?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "When did you discover that news?" Diana's hand went instinctively to her stomach. "A week before the wedding. I was overjoyed, though nervous about telling Richard given our short engagement. Now, of course, I understand why he always seemed reluctant to discuss our future in concrete terms. He wasn't sure there would be a future once you learned the truth about his initial motives, Rose suggested. My brother has many faults, but once he genuinely fell in love with you, he was tortured by his deception. Edward's plan was clever in its cruelty, Miss Marple observed, using Richard's grief to manipulate him, directing his suspicions toward Sir William, orchestrating your meeting, all building toward a moment when the truth would destroy both families. The truly awful thing, Diana said quietly, is that Father was in London that day. He was there for a medical consultation about my mother's cancer. His appointment was at the same hospital where they brought Elizabeth Carmichael after the accident. He's been carrying that guilt for years, thinking he might have somehow helped her if he'd known. According to both their statements, Diana had found Edward's old letters to Elizabeth hidden in Mildred's room while looking for a borrowed shawl. She recognized his handwriting on some of Richard's investigation notes and put it together. She confronted Richard, who was genuinely shocked. He'd had no idea of Edward's personal connection to his mother. And after their argument, Diana returned to her room, intending to cancel the wedding the next morning. But then she overheard Edward and Mildred arguing in the library about what to do if Diana exposed them. Edward suggested they might need to silence her. That's when Diana decided to disappear. A wise decision, Miss Marple commented. And the blood in her room? Alice's, as we established, Craddock confirmed, but deliberately placed there by Mildred to suggest foul play. Mildred hoped the investigation would focus on Richard while she searched for the letters Diana had taken. The letters that proved her presence in London the day of the hit-and-run, Miss Marple mused. And what of Diana's pregnancy? Has she shared that news with Richard? Craddock looked surprised. How did you— Never mind. Yes, she has. It was the first thing she told him after his release. Despite everything, they seem determined to work through this together. Young love can be remarkably resilient, Miss Marple observed with a small smile. As Craddock departed, promising to keep her informed of further developments, Miss Marple remained in her garden, contemplating the complex web of human emotions that had led to this point: obsession, rejection, jealousy, revenge, and ultimately, love. The patterns were familiar to her, echoes of human nature she had observed throughout her long life. The afternoon sun cast lengthening shadows across her garden as she considered the players in this drama. Edward Latimer, whose obsessive love had twisted into something dark and destructive. Mildred Lacey, whose unrequited feelings had made her vulnerable to manipulation. Richard Carmichael, who had begun a courtship in deception but found genuine love. And Diana, whose courage and clear thinking had ultimately saved her life and exposed the truth. As Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to go inside, she wondered what would come of Richard and Diana. Could a relationship founded on such complicated deception ever truly flourish? Perhaps, she thought, if the foundation of genuine feeling was strong enough. After all, the human heart had a remarkable capacity for forgiveness, even in the face of extraordinary circumstances. Chapter 12. Reflections and New Beginnings. 3 months had passed since the dramatic events at the old mill. The leaves were beginning to turn, painting the countryside around St. Mary Mead in rich golds and reds. Miss Marple sat in her garden, enjoying the autumn sunshine while she worked on a tiny knitted cardigan. "It's coming along beautifully," observed Mrs. Bantry, who had stopped by for tea and village gossip. When is Diana expected to deliver? Not until February, Miss Marple replied, counting stitches. But one can never start too early with baby things. And they're definitely staying in the area? Mrs. Bantry inquired, helping herself to a scone. Yes, they've taken the old Pritchard house on the edge of the village. Sir William offered them continued residence at Gossington Hall, but Diana felt they needed their own home to make a fresh start. The trial of Edward Latimer and Mildred Lacey had concluded the previous week, resulting in substantial prison sentences for both. Edward's elaborate revenge plot, spanning years and involving multiple deceptions, had particularly shocked the EDE court. Mildred's testimony, attempting to portray herself as merely a pawn in Edward's schemes, had been undermined by evidence of her active participation and subsequent efforts to threaten Diana. "Have you seen the latest about Carmichael shipping in the papers?" Mrs. Bantry asked, changing the subject. "Quite the turnaround. They're saying Richard might save the company after all." "Yes, with the evidence Diana discovered proving Edward's embezzlement, they've been able to recover significant funds and rebuild client relationships," Miss Marple confirmed. "Richard has shown quite the head for business, now that he's focused on the right things." "And what about the sister, Rose? Has she remained in the village too?" "For now," Miss Marple nodded. "She's been helping Diana prepare the nursery. I believe she plans to travel after the baby is born. She's quite keen to establish her own identity after years of living in her brother's shadow." As Mrs. Bantry departed, promising to return with news from her upcoming visit to London, Miss Marple continued with her knitting. The rhythm of the needles was soothing, allowing her mind to wander over the case that had so occupied the village's attention. The afternoon was fading when she heard the garden gate open. Looking up, she saw Diana approaching along the path, her pregnancy now visible beneath her autumn coat. "Miss Marple," Diana greeted her warmly. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied, setting aside her knitting. "Do sit down. Can I offer you some tea?" "Thank you, but I can't stay long. Richard is waiting in the car. We've just come from the solicitor's office in Much Benham." Diana settled herself carefully in the chair Mrs. Bantry had vacated. "I wanted to bring you this personally." She handed Miss Marple a small, carefully wrapped package. Inside was an exquisite silver butterfly brooch, its wings inlaid with delicate blue stones. "It's beautiful," Miss Marple exclaimed, genuinely touched. "But I don't understand." "It was my mother's," Diana explained. "The butterfly was special to her, a symbol of transformation and new beginnings. When I was struggling with what to do after discovering the truth about Richard and Edward, I remembered something she once told me, that even the most difficult transformations can lead to something beautiful." "A wise perspective," Miss Marple observed, studying the brooch. "I wanted you to have it as a thank you," Diana continued, "not just for helping to solve the case, but for your faith in the possibility of redemption. When everyone else believed the worst of Richard based on his initial deception, you saw the potential for genuine change. People are capable of remarkable transformation when motivated by love rather than hatred or revenge," Miss Marple replied simply. "I've observed it many times over the years." Diana nodded, her hand resting lightly on her growing belly. "We're thinking of naming the baby Elizabeth if it's a girl," she said quietly. "A way of honoring Richard's mother and beginning to heal old wounds." "I think that would be lovely," Miss Marple responded with a gentle smile. After Diana left, Miss Marple pinned the butterfly brooch to her cardigan and returned to her knitting, reflecting on the strange and twisting path that had led to this moment. What had begun as a revenge plot spanning years had ultimately failed in the face of genuine human connection. Richard's feelings for Diana had proven stronger than Edward's careful manipulation. Diana's courage and clear thinking had overcome deception and threat. Even Sir William was beginning to emerge from the shadow of past tragedy, focusing on the future grandchild rather than old griefs. As twilight settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple completed the tiny cardigan and set it aside with satisfaction. Tomorrow she would begin work on a matching bonnet. Life, with all its complications and mysteries, its patterns of human behavior, both destructive and redemptive, continued to unfold around her. And with her keen eyes and deep understanding of human nature, Jane Marple would continue to observe, to interpret, and occasionally, when circumstances required, to gently guide events toward justice and truth. The vanishing bride had been found, not just physically but emotionally, discovering her own strength and clarity of purpose in the midst of crisis. Richard had found something too, a genuine connection worth more than revenge, and the opportunity to build something honest after a foundation of deception. Even Rose had found a new path forward, separate from her brother's shadow. Miss Marple smiled to herself as she closed her knitting bag and rose to prepare for dinner. The evening star was visible now in the darkening sky, bright and clear. Another day concluded, another mystery solved. And in a village like St. Mary Mead, one never knew when the next puzzle might present itself, challenging her to once again apply her lifelong study of human nature to unravel the complexities of another unexpected crime.